how awful is it to take a Saint Bernard, the friendliest of the dog species, and make it the evil Cujo dog? That was Stephen King, man. There's something wrong in that guy's head. But
Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. This is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. Joining me is the History Guy himself and friend of the History Guy, Brad Wagnon. Today, we talk about one of the deadliest diseases in human history, and one we often don't think about at all: rabies. How has it changed the world, and what might be different without it? Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
The phrase, "but we still haven't cured the common cold," is more than a complaint that we still have to suffer from a stuffy nose. It's emblematic of the fact that despite all of our medical advances, the cures for many illnesses still simply elude us. And that is certainly true of one of the oldest diseases known to man. One so terrifying that it is probably the genesis of vampire, werewolf, and zombie myths. Despite millennia of struggle against rabies, it is still one of the deadliest illnesses known to man. The history of the human contest with rabies deserves to be remembered.
Rabies is a type of viral encephalitis, that is a virus that causes inflammation of the brain. Symptoms might include fever and pain, and as the virus attacks the nervous system, hyperactivity and excitable behavior, excessive salivating, confusion, and hydrophobia, strong fear of water. Rabies has sometimes historically been called hydrophobia owing to that symptom. And the symptoms represent a unique problem. The disease can only be diagnosed by its symptoms, but by the time those symptoms appear, it is already too late.
WebMD, and let's face it, that's where we all get our medical advice these days, says that if it is not treated before symptoms appear, it is deadly. Rabies has the highest mortality rate, 99.9% of any disease on Earth.
Rabies is most commonly spread by being bitten by an infected mammal, most commonly both historically and today, dogs, but also other mammals, including cats and foxes. That has been going on for a very long time. It is unclear just when and where rabies originated. A 2012 phylogenetic analysis published in the Journal of General Biology suggests that the current canine genotype of the illness might have been predated by another genotype. But the human connection, and by far most common way the illness is spread, is by being bitten by a dog, and dogs have been man's best friend for quite some time. But dogs' relationship with rabies might well have come first. The website History of Yesterday explains, the friendship between humans and dogs began approximately 33,000 to 40,000 years ago. And before the recording of history began, the dogs came into contact with the terrifying rabies virus. Rabies is one of the oldest diseases to have been recorded. A 2017 article in the Journal of Tropical Medicine and Infectious Diseases entitled 4,000 Years of Concepts Relating to Rabies in Animals and Humans points to a cuneiform tablet recording the laws of Eshnunna, a Sumerian and later Akkadian city-state located in present-day Tel Asmar, Iraq, dating back some 4,000 years. If a dog becomes rabid and makes that authority known to its owner, but he does not watch over his dog so that it bites a man and causes his death, the owner of the dog shall pay 40 shekels of silver. That is a huge sum. The journal notes that the Code of Hammurabi lists the cost of a boat at just 2 shekels. More records are found in several so-called dog incantations, suggesting that these ancient people suspected that the cause was related to the dog's saliva, as well as medical texts from the era recognizing that once the person is infected, death is certain. In fact, the deadly nature of rabies might even predate these texts. Both Yama, the Hindu god of death, and Gula, the Babylonian god of medicine, are attended by dogs. While the etymology is uncertain, the word rabies, derived from the Latin word for madness, might itself have been derived from an ancient Sanskrit word meaning to rage. The journal article notes that the disease was described by several figures in classical antiquity, including Aristotle, Hippocrates, Pliny, Ovid, and Cicero, as well as Chinese texts dating at least back to the 3rd century A.D. The name of the genus that includes the rabies virus, Lyssa virus, is derived from the ancient Greek word for violence, Lyssa. Works in this period recognize that the disease was somehow related to the animal saliva and suggest prevention of the disease by taking steps to prevent people from being bitten. The 2nd century Greek philosopher Celsus suggested cauterizing a wound when bitten. Although the efficacy of the treatment is unknown, its practice continued into the 19th century.
According to veterinarian Fielding O'Neill of Richmond, Virginia's Tuckahoe Animal Hospital, Celsus also incorrectly suggested a cure for rabies by holding the victim underwater. Those that didn't drown died of rabies.
While these authors seem to have well described the disease's symptoms, like the ancient Babylonians 2 millennia before, they had no cure for a person who was infected beyond prayer. It isn't clear exactly how much effect the illness had on these societies, but the fact that their medical literature is so thorough on the subject suggests it was recognized as a significant threat. On August 18th, 180 BC, the Dowager Empress Lu of the Han Dynasty died suddenly at the age of 61, despite apparently being in good health. While the cause of her death has been a historical mystery, even at the time some connected her death to a dog bite the previous March, with one text writing, "The demon resembles a dog." Today it is widely accepted among scholars that her cause of death was likely rabies. Her death resulted in significant political turmoil in China, including the massacre of her clan. Rabies continued to be the subject of medical works in the Middle Ages. One common treatment in medieval Europe was to place the hair of the dog that delivered the bite, sometimes after being charred, into the wound, a cure first suggested by Roman naturalist and physician Pliny the Elder in the 1st century A.D.
According to the medical dictionary at MedicineNet, that is the etymology of the term the hair of the dog that bit you, which refers to an alcoholic chaser that supposedly cures a hangover. Dr. O'Neill notes that while the hair of the dog might cure a hangover, it did nothing to cure rabies.
In 9th century Belgium, the city of Liège became a center for the treatment of rabies, owing to the presence of the bones of St. Hubert, the patron saint of hunters. Prevention was accomplished by burning a dog with a heated metal key, called a key of St. Hubert, which was supposed to prevent the dog from becoming infected. Copies of such a key were also hung in homes to ward off the infection. Humans, once infected, were treated by, according to the Journal of Tropical Medicine and Infectious Disease, incision of the forehead and implantation of threads from the saint's supposedly miraculous stole, accompanied by prayers and fasting. The results were predictable. In fact, people exhibiting symptoms were often simply smothered to death between 2 mattresses to prevent their suffering the advanced symptoms and from infecting others. Such treatments actually might be administered precipitously, as the history of yesterday notes. Sometimes they were overzealous in their attempts to prevent the spread of rabies. Individuals who had been bitten sometimes committed suicide or were killed by others, often without letting time pass to see if the person became symptomatic. In a bizarre twist, the journal notes that the potentially deadly role of saliva was put to use by 17th century Polish-Lithuanian artillery general Kazimierz Siemianowicz, who, in an early attempt at biological warfare, says to have fired hollow shells containing saliva of rabid dogs in 1650. The 2010 book Hospital Preparation for Bioterror writes, "It is unknown whether General Siemianowicz was successful with his tactical use of animal saliva." Despite the connection often made by writers of fiction between rabies and vampires, French veterinarian and microbiologist Jean Blanquot notes that rabies in bats was not discovered until it was found in the New World on Columbus's 5th voyage in 1511.
That is, Europeans did not encounter a rabid bat until more than 3 decades after the death of Vlad the Impaler.
An article in a 2017 edition of Antiviral Research concludes that phylogenetic analysis suggests that rabies was present in the Americas prior to the first European colonizers, but was limited to bats and skunks. Canine rabies was, however, either non-existent or rare in the Americas and was introduced when Europeans imported new dog breeds to the continent. By the 18th century, methods of prevention, including promulgating rules for the keeping of dogs and the destruction of strays, mitigated risk and drastically reduced the incidence of rabies in many locations, although no progress had been made to cure those who had been bitten. The understanding of the nature of the illness continued to progress. In 1804, German physician Georg Gottfried Zinke showed that the disease could be passed from a rabid dog to a healthy one, and to rabbits and hens by injecting them with the dog's saliva. Still, a cure had not been discovered. One odd 19th century solution was the mad stone. History of Yesterday explains. These were gallstones, or stones found in the stomachs of various animals, formed from calcium deposits around a hair or other foreign object in the stomach. These stones were thought to draw the poison out of a fresh wound. Although the practice is thought to have originated in Europe, these became quite popular in the United States. The website Shelby County Today writes, for example, that in East Texas, there were resident madstones in Houston, Dallas, Plano, Corsicana, Denison, Kaufman, and a few other towns. These stones were owned and used by medical doctors, preachers, policemen, as well as private citizens. The famous Kaufman stone was kept, of all places, at the county treasurer's office. The stone would be heated in milk and applied to the site of the bite. In 1877, the Kansas New Era of Valley Falls, Kansas quoted T.C. Watkins of Murfreesboro, Illinois. There is a madstone in this vicinity owned by Homer Sturdivant. That there is virtue in it I am positive, both in curing the bite of rabid animals and that of poisonous reptiles. I have seen it tested. The paper cites several examples and concludes, if all the madstones possess the efficacy ascribed to them, the bite of a rabid dog need not necessarily prove fatal, as has long generally been supposed. But the Davie Record of Mocksville, North Carolina, expressed skepticism in 1912, writing, "Why, a madstone is just as good as a brickbat to prevent rabies." The paper writes off stories of madstones succeeding, opining not every dog that is supposed to be mad is really mad. Madstones notwithstanding, the illness continued to kill. In 1813, Charles Lennox, the Duke of Richmond and Governor General of Canada, died of hydrophobia after being bitten by a fox. In 1996, a group of doctors at a medical conference were presented a hypothetical set of symptoms and asked for a diagnosis. Their conclusion was that the person described as E.P., a writer from Richmond, died of rabies. The actual case was that of writer Edgar Allan Poe, who died in 1849, although the diagnosis cannot be confirmed. In 1868, Italian painter Giuseppe Abati died after being bitten by his own dog. In 1882, George Robertson Reeves, Speaker of the House of the state of Texas, died of rabies after being bitten while defending a child being attacked by a dog. As the disease progressed, he was locked in a room padded with mattresses to keep him from harming himself. When Viscount Hayes St. Ledger contracted hydrophobia in 1887 after being bitten by his pet fox, his housemates smothered him with pillows to spare him the ravages of the illness. The great breakthrough came in 1885. Since 1881, Louis Pasteur, who had already developed a successful vaccination protecting cattle from anthrax, worked on creating a vaccine to protect dogs from rabies. He first grew the virus in rabbits, then weakened it by drying the nerve tissue. Although it took decades before comprehensive vaccination programs were established, vaccinating pets has drastically reduced the number of people infected. In 1885, Pasteur used the vaccine on 9-year-old Joseph Meister, who had been mauled by a rabid dog. Pasteur could have been jailed for the experiment, as he was not actually a doctor, but went ahead, knowing that the boy would otherwise die. Dr. O'Neill writes, Joseph received 13 inoculations in 11 days and made a complete recovery. The word leaked out, and patients came streaming in the world over. At the time of Pasteur's death 9 years later, over 20,000 people had been given his post-exposure prophylactic vaccine.
Pasteur's vaccine is a type of treatment after exposure that's called a post-exposure protection, or PEP, although it could be given prior to exposure for someone who is, say, at high risk. But it must be delivered before the virus takes hold and symptoms appear in order to be effective. What originally took up to 20 shots has now been refined to require just 4 shots, and if it is delivered quickly, say within 10 days of exposure, it is nearly 100% effective.
Today, the World Health Organization estimates that an average of 59,000 people die of rabies worldwide each year, with most deaths occurring in Asia and Africa. While there are risks from wild animals, and particularly from bats in the Americas, dogs are responsible for 99% of rabies transmission to humans. The organization focuses both on prevention and in making PEP more widely available. In 2004, a protocol that uses sedation while administering antiviral medications produced the first person in U.S. history to survive rabies without prophylactic vaccination treatment, a 15-year-old girl. The protocol, however, has a low success rate. A 2017 study concluded that of 36 people treated, just 5 survived.
But the low success rate and high cost of the so-called Milwaukee Protocol means that it is at best a treatment of last resort, and that rabies continues to be one of the deadliest diseases known to man, still the scourge that it has been throughout history. As the Journal of Tropical Medicine and Infectious Diseases laments, clinicians who provide care to animals and patients with symptomatic rabies are as powerless today as their colleagues in Mesopotamia were 40 centuries ago.
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself, and longtime friend of the history guy Brad Wagnon, discuss what might have happened if it all went differently. So today we are talking about rabies, and this is a really interesting one. I think that rabies has, you don't necessarily think about it a lot, but I think that it has really
Mhm.
impacted our relationship, especially with wildlife and with animals in general,
Mhm.
in ways that are more deeply seated than a modern mind understands, especially because rabies is not as big a deal today as it was, a few hundred years ago. It,
Especially here in the Western world and the
yeah,
first world. I mean, it's still a major killer in the third world.
yes.
But it is,
Let's,
I mean, if you talk about diseases, yeah, how much of diseases impacted the world, rabies is really an interesting one, kind of a
yeah,
subtle one. And I think that the differences we'll see are going to be kind of interesting, maybe not so immediately earth-shattering as some of the things that we've talked about. I mean, it's just kind of fascinating. But the video starts off with the fact that I think most people don't realize we kind of think of rabies as almost being licked here
yeah,
in the West, and actually, it's not. If you have rabies, if you have rabies long enough to get symptoms, then you're dead. I mean, it is still essentially a 100% fatality, and I think people aren't necessarily aware of that. And it does show that how what a knife edge rabies could be between something that we almost take for granted as having been cured and something that actually is could be a devastating impact on the population. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, the first counterfactual, if rabies was any more virulent than it already is, I don't know that we would necessarily be in existence to make podcasts
yeah,
because it is, yeah, truly a deadly disease. And the only, I hesitate to call it a cure, but the Milwaukee protocol that they've used apparently has saved 5 out of 35 lives,
yeah, yeah,
but
very different. Yeah.
that is a vanishingly small number.
It
well,
is
Uh,
very difficult, yeah, and only young people essentially have survived it. So,
yeah.
I mean, but we have we have the prophylactic vaccine now. If you're bitten, if there's a suspect of rabies, then they can give you if you get the shot before you get symptoms, it makes a difference. The funny thing is, if rabies were a little bit less virulent, if you survived with rabies, then that would truly be the zombie apocalypse. What is the zombie
Yeah.
apocalypse if not, people with rabies running around biting other people, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, if you think about it, all things zombie. We've got Zombieland, we've got Walking Dead, we've got,
Yeah.
as far back as 1968,
Oh,
and
that's right.
actually even back into the 30s,
Where would we be
films that
without
are based
Romero?
on
Yes, yeah.
some virulent
Yeah.
disease that causes, irrational, aggressive behavior.
It
And
is, yeah. I
yeah,
mean, originally zombies were because I did an episode on the movie White Zombie. Originally, zombies were dead people that had been raised by a witch doctor, and now they're essentially rabid corpses.
yeah.
So rabies altered completely altered our understanding of zombies. We can start with that. That's clearly the
Yeah.
most important effect. Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, okay.
they think that rabies is connected to things like vampire myths and things like that, but actually zombies. Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's maybe the
Uh,
most clear connection.
yeah.
Yeah, there are several video games for all my video gamer friends out there. Yes, congratulations, you've made it onto the podcast. But yeah, there are several video games that have some kind of a, basically a zombie-like creature, but it is the result of some variant and potentially genetically modified version of rabies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's certainly one of the. I mean, but I mean that is it's funny as that is. Again, it gets to the. I mean, the illness sits kind of on the fringe of something that could be so much more than it is. Despite the fact that it still kills on the order of 60,000 people a year.
Yeah.
When you talk about how deadly animals are, dogs are really only deadly because of rabies. There's very little in terms of people being killed by dogs, except for the fact that they
Yeah.
become a vector for rabies. And I think we're going to see that the impact on pets and et cetera is probably be one of the biggest things that we talked
Yeah.
about. But I didn't mean to wander us on zombies
It's
just
not a
yet.
bad place though, because that's not just we've talked about things like the effect on pop culture before. It's not just pop culture. Because the reason, we have zombies or werewolves I saw mentioned is that this is,
Mhm.
something that if you bite it changes you and
Yep.
that those kind of fears, now we kind of see those as quaint or silly, but for much of human history, the idea that something like that was very real and very frightening. I mean, dangerous. I mean, an existential kind of fear for humanity and for yourself and your family. I mean, those were real fears. And I think that when you talk about a counterfactual, for rabies, imagining a world where we don't have something that really did exist as this kind of underlying fear, I mean, I think that's significant.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just that we might not have the same kinds of villains in these kind of fictional ones, and we wouldn't have the monster universe. We would also not have what kind of created those in to begin with, and that's meaningful.
Yeah, I mean that's a significant piece of culture, and we kind of, to an extent, we build our society around protecting ourselves from those fears.
Yeah.
If we're doing that, of course, we have to mention vampires too. Much of the vampire myth is probably related to everything from foaming at the mouth to biting other humans to the fear of light and the effect of holy water and all the sort of stuff. That's all also connected to rabies. The vampire myth might predate rabies, but rabies has defined much of what the vampire myth is.
I read even that they might have reactions to garlic because you can have reactions to strong smells when you're under the influence when you're sick with rabies. That's
obviously at least from a cultural viewpoint, the wolf man is an exact match for rabies, if you will. Just the symptoms are slightly different.
We don't necessarily grow hair, but yes, the animal bites you. You take on traits of the animal, and then if you bite other people, then you pass along those traits. That's obviously very much attached to Wolfman theory. So, again, it's not just a matter of, say, movies. It is a matter of so much of our society is kind of ordered around the idea that we have these fears. And one of the reasons that we watch the movies is because we like to be able to engage those fears in a safe environment, because those fears protect us. So, I mean, there's really not much in terms of disease that works quite like rabies does. Many diseases are communicable from human to human, but I mean, not in a way that's as direct and aggressive as the human walks up and bites you. That a disease that can change human behavior, that can cause you to, I mean, literally lose your sanity. That's a significantly terrifying thing for all of us. People are afraid of losing their mind. They're afraid of people that they know losing their mind. So it brings back, I mean, lots of our fears, fears of age and fears of all sorts of things that can be kind of tied to this illness that apparently predates human civilization. It might have been with us from the very beginning.
Something I found interesting is that even as far back as antiquity, the people who observed rabies actually put two and two together and got that it was the saliva of the infected critter that was causing the disease. And so that was an example where actually someone observed something so directly and they got it right the first time. Now they really couldn't do anything with it because it's a viral infection, and technology of the era wasn't able to really do anything effective about that. And all of the folk remedies, typical of most folk remedies, you read them now and you almost have to laugh. Some of them are just so off the wall.
Burning someone with a key, or using a Bazar that a goat pooped out. Yeah, that's or
the hair of the dog that bit you.
Yeah, the hair of the dog that bit you. Yeah, I mean, you can see why they're looking for it, but I mean, those show that the remedies were more mystic. I mean, they weren't even really herbal. I mean, they didn't even match ideas of medicine at the time. So that it really shows that that it was kind of perceived almost as a wrath of God. But I mean, it's a terrifying illness in that you're bitten, and aside from a dog bite, you're perfectly fine. But your death is inevitable. That's and inevitable from badness. I mean, to the point where they would, smother themselves rather than endure it. That's a terrifying idea, that you would be able to see your own demise and do nothing about it, and die, frothing at the mouth animal. And so as you talk about it, it's history. I mean, it's interesting history, and it's also interesting history how we slowly over time came to try to deal with rabies. I think it's interesting today that rabies continues to be a very deadly illness outside of certain countries, because the solution requires a level of resources that we just don't necessarily have everywhere else. So in America, virtually every dog you see has been vaccinated. And that's not true in parts of the world where dogs are an important part of culture, but live closer to the wild and aren't being vaccinated. So it is. I think there's a lot to say that rabies is a reason to be of note. It is interesting to try to get to though. How would history be different? I guess there's two different scenarios here. How would history be different without rabies? And how would history be different without our medical responses to rabies? Because those both are related to the video.
Well, that
And
could
that
go far
that's
back,
interesting
even
because
before
there's
the
some illnesses where like all sorts of presidents died of it and popes died of it, and you could say, oh, generals died of it. History would be so different it wasn't them. Rabies isn't quite that way. It's actually been kind of choosy in the people that it killed, and not necessarily mostly people that were themselves huge impacts on history. So it was a difficult one to research. I don't know about you guys. It was a difficult one for me to research to say, how different would the world really be
yeah.
were it not for rabies, because there's not a really obvious, this turning point occurred because of rabies. And so, I mean, it's an interesting question.
I do think that even into the mid 20th century and late 20th century, that is still one of the scare stories that parents would always tell their children, is that if you see a strange dog, don't interact with it. You might get bitten, and then we'll have to take you to the doctor, and you'll have to receive 20 very painful injections into your stomach.
Your stomach,
Uh,
yeah.
it was I quite clearly remember that these were the facts that were presented, along with the fact that somehow ducking beneath a desk would protect us from nuclear bombs or
Sure.
tornadoes.
It does kind
we
of
had,
show
we had all
how
sorts of
much
bad
that
advice in our.
how much that fear stuck on though, because I mean, we're in a society that has, if not totally eradicated, I mean, it's kills very few people in the United States, and I mean in most of Western Europe it's essentially it doesn't exist,
Yeah,
and
it's
yet
rare.
we
It's rare in the
still,
first world. It's in the
yeah,
third world that it's more of a danger. But see, I mean, if you look in the scheme of the things that kill people, 50 some thousand a year is I mean, it's horrifying. I grew up in a town of 5,000 people, for heaven's sakes, but it's not large, compared to other, causes of death still. And
Yeah.
I mean that shows. I mean, it's a strange illness, but one that terrifies you even if it's not so much around. And as we were mentioning, cultural impacts. By the way, because everybody has to know this, is that rabies killed Old Yeller. So possibly the saddest scene in the history of film is because of rabies. I
could have been
challenge anyone
saved
to
from
watch
that.
Old Yeller and not cry at the end, and that impact on culture is rabies.
Kind of
If you
on
can
that.
avoid crying, you have no heart.
You have no
Yeah.
heart. How dare you? If you if
On
you if you watch Old Yeller and you don't cry, don't mention it in the comments, because that's
don't
you
want
don't
to
want to
know.
admit that to people. No.
you know on that line, I mean, I think one of the things that could have happened here, especially, I mean, you see how deeply ingrained the fear of it was and how early we connected it to dogs. I mean, they're talking in some of the earliest, civilizational law codes, they were talking about rabid dogs. We could have made the choice, when we brought dogs in, there were a lot of positives to how
Hmm.
that relationship worked. It's possible that we could have, as kind of a society, chosen to get rid of dogs because we were so afraid of
Hmm.
rabies. And I ultimately we didn't do that. I mean, clearly that we love our dogs, but you could imagine a world where we decided this is too dangerous and we got rid of them.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, if you
I
look at
can
today, where I mean, we bubble wrap much more than we used to in
Yeah.
society. But I mean, if there were not both the rabies prophylactic for dogs, where you give them the shot and that they can't get rabies, and the fact that we have a treatment if you get rabies, then it would be probably illegal in any city in America, maybe in the first world, to keep your dog outside. And the dogs would be much less common as pets. Cats
yeah.
too. I mean, cats also can get rabies, and they probably wouldn't be on the outside. We also might be a lot more aggressive on a lot of wildlife management
Yeah.
too. I mean, right now we don't really do a lot to manage skunks and raccoons and possums and things that can come with rabies. And we certainly might. We cull populations pretty quickly if rabies spreads through them. And so, yeah, you're right. It would certainly impact wildlife and environment and pets.
Yeah,
Which
I
would be
would
great
say
for Brad because, you wouldn't have to have the allergy problem you have at all your friends' houses. Yeah.
you do know that Zyrtec comes in an economy size. I can tell you exactly where to get it. It's like 300 tablets at a time because yeah, that's yes, that is my hay fever. To your point, Lance. Okay, imagine a world where there is no rabies. Imagine imagine a world where the population pretty much of the entire world has pets at home, has very strong bonds to those pets. They use them for everything from pack animals to assisting in hunting, much like we do today. Um, and so I would say that you would probably get even more interaction between humans and dogs, and there would be even a stronger bond. But
Oh, yeah.
rabies, to an
Mhm.
extent, has been kind of that puts the brakes on that. And if you look at if you look at popular culture in the 1700s and earlier, dog ownership, yeah, it's there.
Yeah.
The Lord has his hunting hounds. Perhaps the woodsman has his trusty dog, to help keep him safe from wolves or whatever.
Yeah.
But you don't have what we have currently, which I'm going to argue may actually be a negative impact of this, where Chihuahuas are carried about in handbags.
You're right. Yes.
Um, yeah, when I get onto a
Yeah. Dogs,
plane with
dogs
my
are all
hay
working
fever,
purpose. Companion dogs are, you're right. Yeah.
yeah. Now, the positive of that, of course, is that we have dogs that are service animals,
Hmm.
and they do phenomenal work. And with the correct training, a service dog. Yeah, imagine if service dogs were available in war-torn parts of the world where rabies is such a concern that you just don't even think about it, or
Hmm.
that you're at least reluctant to consider it.
And there certainly was a period in the 16th, 17th, 18th century where there was a lot of control over dog ownership because of rabies and culling any apparently feral dog, any apparently a dog that didn't have an owner, a stray, was going to be killed. And that would probably continue if it weren't for I mean, to an extent it is. I mean, stray dogs are always considered a risk, yeah, to the public. But I mean, if your dog got off the leash, then your dog was probably not going to come home because if they caught the dog, they were going to euthanize the dog. So I certainly we could say there's an effect, and those of us who own animals know how powerful it is, and that we pet ownership would at least be a different level of risk, were it not for our ability to
Yeah.
treat rabies, if rabies continued the way that it once did.
I do want to
Yeah.
mention, just because I know someone's already typing this out, opossums specifically are not generally rabies
Yeah,
carriers because
subject to rabies. Yeah,
they have low body temperatures. I know someone out there heard possums and is
yes, yes,
so, but
yes, sure. You're right.
in general
Possums
you're
are very
safe. But
beneficial animals, and I did not mean to slander possums. Yes, I'm sorry.
they probably don't have rabies even if they look like it. But it is very
They
much
do look.
like they foam at the mouth and stuff when they're playing
They
dead.
look a
So
lot meaner than they are. Yes, possums. Yeah. No, I still wouldn't pick a possum up. They're
I,
a wild animal.
I think you shouldn't. Yeah, that's that as a rule. Don't grab them by the tail. That's
And
I
well,
do
Actually, yeah,
I do
actually,
think
as I get reminded of every year when people go up and try to touch the bison in national parks, interaction with any wild animal,
is a bad
yeah,
idea. Yes.
exercise extreme caution, and not doing it is probably the correct answer.
yeah
Though to be fair, it's very unlikely that you will find a rabid bison.
This is true.
They don't need to be.
no they can send you
The,
flying with
the
that.
grizzly bear does not have to be rabid because his saliva is not going to be your biggest problem.
Nope.
There is, we talked about culling and stuff like that. I mean, one of the things that if rabies just didn't exist, it might have
Mhm.
dramatically changed our interactions with the wild world. Because I mean, one of those things is at foxes, raccoons, skunks, all of these kinds of
Mhm.
things that can have rabies. One of the reasons why we tamed the wild the way we did, where I mean, some of those have threats, especially like wolves, where going to kill your livestock and stuff like that. But one of the reasons we wiped those out is because of the fear of they can carry rabies and cause. I mean, a fox is not that dangerous to you unless it
Mhm.
has rabies,
Unless it has rabies, yeah, it's carrying out a.
and
Yeah.
so that's
That's actually one of the more famous people who died from rabies died because he had a pet fox. Yeah, so
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. That there are animal populations that have been culled to large extents, not because foxes are also, I guess, a risk to chickens. I mean, there's probably a
That's
wild, or
fair.
there's
That's
probably a domestic animal thing reason for foxes, but I mean, fox in the hen house is like literally the phrase, right? But you're right. I mean, there's populations that are culled because of rabies, but on the other hand, too, there are populations that can be dangerous in being prolific.
yeah.
That rabies acts as a as a natural culling limitation on their overpopulation. And so, I mean, there's a reason that illnesses occur in the wild, that they develop in the wild, and you know what they do. And one of the things that rabies does is it does mean that we're not overrun by skunks,
Yeah.
because it serves as a limit on them.
Yeah. I do think that without rabies, it's possible that someone would have made an attempt to more domesticate the raccoon. Skunks, they come with their own problem.
Yeah.
And
Skunks. I've seen people with domesticated skunks. They're
Or
very
these
cute. Well, you know
things.
whatever ferrets have glands too, have musk,
yeah,
and so that I mean they figured out ways around that. But yeah, you're right. I wonder foxes and raccoons are two things that seem to be on the list of things that you might domesticate, and are two things that I think people have tried to domesticate. But I wonder if one of the reasons that we don't have pet foxes and raccoons on the same level we have pet cats and dogs was because of the propensity of them as a wild species to rabies.
yeah.
And they do. I
I
mean,
think
but
that's a definite.
we actually
I,
do vaccinate in the wild too. I mean, if you've got a population with rabies, they'll literally go out and put out food with the vaccination in it, and try to vaccinate the wild animals.
yeah, the fact that that started with them dropping chicken heads with the little tab inside that essentially was the inoculant is it makes for a very macabre but entertaining story.
Do you want to teach a fox to eat your chicken? Throw 'em, anti-rabies chicken heads. Yeah.
There is, I think, maybe the next big counterfactual is we have rabies as normal, but Pasteur, for one reason or another, doesn't invent that vaccine. And
Hmm.
this was an important point with that vaccine is that um, earlier vaccines, because this was not the first, it's smallpox inoculation, and that there were things that we did, but they were not uncontroversial. I mean, these days I
Hmm.
think you would find it a little hard to believe that people didn't want to protect themselves from smallpox, but these we didn't have an idea of the germ theory of disease. We didn't really understand
Hmm.
disease. I mean, that vaccine was something we used because it proved to be effective without us understanding its full efficacy. If he doesn't invent that vaccine, I mean, this was where people saw it as a miracle cure because it went from
Hmm.
a disease that would kill you for sure to something that we could almost always survive as long as you got treatment fast
Absolutely.
enough.
Well, and also that you could vaccinate your dog, so you didn't
Yeah,
have to have a fear
yeah.
from your own animal. Yeah.
Yeah, it absolutely changed the kind of public perception of what a vaccine was and what it could do, and that was because of how deadly it was. That's
Yeah.
one of the
Absolutely.
things
Yeah.
with smallpox. You could live through smallpox, as horrible as it was. People still had hesitancy about it. That didn't exist with rabies because by the time you were getting it, you were desperate to be saved.
Yeah,
You'd been
yeah.
given a death
Otherwise, because
sentence.
the alternative was to lock you in a room until
Yeah,
until you died of fever
yeah,
in the head. Yeah, that's certainly
Yeah,
true.
or
And it's, I mean, it's kind of more than that. I mean, partly there are actually some of those types of vaccines, those
yeah,
the PHP vaccines that occur, that where you can mitigate after you have the illness, and those would probably not exist if we hadn't, or there's a good chance they wouldn't exist if we hadn't come to accept the rabies vaccine. But the rabies vaccine was really the beginning of virology and the whole understanding of what a virus is. So if that hadn't occurred, and maybe you're right, if rabies wasn't so deadly, would we have created the field of virology, or would we have created it, as soon as we did? And that could impact diseases that have much broader impacts on society. And we're actually getting to the point where we're starting to be able to treat things like the common cold and the flu because of understanding of a virus that virology began with, really trying to understand rabies. And we might never have cured the cold. We might cure the common cold, but we might not have if it hadn't been for how deadly rabies is, and forced us into the field of studying virus and virology. And that's a very good point.
yeah,
Certainly,
I think that
medicine derived from the research.
I think that the number one effect of not having a good vaccine for the virus is that first of all, I don't think that we would be in our current modern age in the way that we accept that we're in the modern age, because the ability to control something as deadly as rabies um, gives humanity as an overarching sense of we control nature. We are able to find the cures for the most gruesome and heinous killers, one of them being rabies.
Mm-hmm.
Without that, two things happen. First of all, we continue to have several hundred people or several thousands of people die each year from rabies. And secondly, there is a psychological effect that somehow the natural world is still out to get us and has the upper hand.
Mm-hmm.
And those are subtle, but at the same time, very, very real. And they would certainly have an impact on the way that we view nature, as nature,
And
medicine, and science in general.
and maybe what we're able to accomplish. Yeah, I mean, because our lives are much more free because we feel like we have that kind of control over it. Of course, we don't control. I mean, we can't still deal with tornadoes and hurricanes and your mountain lions. If they attack you, again, you're not worried about their rabies. It's not when the mountain lion tear your throat out. You're like, oh, but I'll get rabies. But certainly it does. It does say, and part of this idea that whenever we encounter a disease, we always have this belief we will eventually conquer that disease. When we talk about one of the PHPs, I mean, we've essentially, those of us from my generation certainly remember when the fear was that AIDS was going to, be the end, and now AIDS is treatable because of virology and with a treatment that is very like the treatment for rabies, a PHP treatment that we might never have been able to accomplish if it weren't for what Pasteur had done with rabies. That's a fair point. And when we get to the cultural impact, because I think we might not, we might be, less interested in going to space if we are more afraid of nature. I mean, it could really impact us. But in terms of the cultural impact, there are a couple of things to mention. So I did mention Old Yeller, by the way. Without rabies, we wouldn't have had the movie Cujo, which, golly, still gives me some nightmares there. How awful is it to take a Saint Bernard, the friendliest of the dog species, and make it the evil Cujo dog? That was Stephen King, man. There's something wrong in that guy's head. But in many ways, you could probably claim that. But I don't care if he tries to sue me because I don't think he's going to be able in court to defend it. There's not something very strange on the head of Stephen King. But I mean, what if we'd had another 20 to 40 years of Edgar Allan Poe?
Yeah.
By the way, to your point, Lance, what is the old saying? Genius often lives upstairs from madness.
Yes.
Yeah, Stephen King is definitely one of those people. Yeah, he made he's thinking of things in very, very unusual and interesting ways, which have a very, very effective outcome when he puts words on the printed page. So anyway, but definitely the effect of, I mean, even if we think about horror movies in general, and back to our earlier comments on zombies, we have that dark fascination with the unknown.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting that ties back to, I don't know how it ties back to Stephen King because he had that stupid rabid dog in that terrifying movie. So I don't mind crying at Old Yeller, but man, I don't need to watch Cujo ever again in my life. It disturbed me as a young man. There are other movies that disturb me more, I have to say. So,
but who knows what new ones there might have been if Poe had survived, right?
You're right.
Certainly
I mean, but how might if we didn't have whatever vampires and werewolves and zombies because we didn't have rabies, what would Edgar Allan Poe have thought up?
That's true. Poe was certainly inspired by the.
Run across something during the research for this topic, and that is went to a virology get together with doctors and gave a list of the symptoms that led to the death of the subject. And the overwhelming answer was rabies. The subject was Edgar Allan Poe.
It was Poe, yeah. So I mean, you do have to be careful about that. You'll hear all the time. You'll see the newspaper will say something like an old mystery has been solved. We don't know that rabies killed Edgar Allan Poe because there's no remains left that can actually be tested for that. But I mean, it's a very compelling theory, and that's what we're saying here is that Poe. Supposedly he was bitten by a cat. If Poe had not died of rabies, if we assume that he did, then he was likely to be married. Who knows how that might have changed Edgar Allan Poe? But he was also planning to start a literary magazine, and who knows what that little literary magazine might have done in terms of popular culture. And so it's a fascinating story. I mean, maybe he wasn't some general that won a battle, maybe he wasn't the president, but I mean, Poe is a man who has
powerful impact on culture, and his life cutting short. It's a little harder to say maybe than some of the ones that we've talked about in terms of counterfactuals. But I mean, it could be. I mean, the significance of the impact he had on culture as is could have been much greater. And who knows what might have come out of the mind of Edgar Allan Poe? Maybe even more disturbing than Stephen King.
Yeah, and what if you have Edgar Allan Poe continues, he creates a publishing empire. He continues to add to his already, fairly extensive, body of work. What if he becomes the first super, media superstar? It is very possible that you might have a carry-on effect where imitators would be okay, let's find promising young talent and let's create our own magazines. Very possibly, the history of literature might have been more along serialized monthly or weekly or whatever publication as opposed to novels.
Fair point. Yeah. With another powerful literary magazine, yeah. I mean, he had such an impact on literature. He had such an impact on culture, though. I mean, that you're right. I mean, if he changes how we publish literature, then that could still be impacting us today in ways that are very powerful. I mean, some see him as really the founder of the detective novel, and some people see him as one of the founders of horror, modern horror. And I mean, that's in a relatively short life. And then what happens if he's gained the reputation that allows him to start this magazine, and he has a greater impact on how we go out with publishing. So again, it's a little bit hard. We have a lot of these when you get into the counterfactuals. It's a little bit hard to say, except that you would think that culture would be different. Maybe we'd all be goth. Maybe all of us would be wearing black.
It was just even more impactful. Yeah, because he's already, you got people who Edgar Allan Poe societies and stuff. So
hand, so I mean, imagine if he'd grown to be sort of the grand man of American publishing, which he could have been, rather than someone who was kind of unrecognized in his time, and someone who left us early. So I mean, what if he goes on for another 20, 40 years and becomes really sort of the story of publishing in America? Then who knows what stories those might be and how those might impact us.
Yeah, and I must point out that if that rock superstar band, the Alan Parsons Project, creates an entire album dedicated to nothing but your stories, you have arrived.
Alan Parsons Project. How many people on this call remember the Alan Parsons Project? Or Cujo, for that matter. Yeah, I love them too. Yeah, let's see. I don't know, but I'm sure we're passing by some of our audience here don't have any idea about half the stuff we talk about. Old Yeller, what? But
they haven't done a reboot of that. That's the.
Yeah, I know. How have they not done a reboot? They've rebooted everything. I think a CGI version of Old Yeller could be.
Operated by AI just to make just to make it dystopian.
There are, there's not a lot of people who are killed by it that are super important. I think one of the most interesting ones you mentioned in the episode is Empress Liu, and you only talk about her a little bit, really. But I mean, her position, she essentially was overthrowing the Chinese,
the Han Dynasty,
and she got very close. And it's honestly, if she had lived another 10 years, we might talk about this golden era, this golden age of Chinese society might not have existed, not in the way it was.
The thing that follows her is they call it golden age. Well, and it's not just overthrowing the Zhou, right? She was very close to eradicating Confucianism.
Yeah.
How different would Chinese history have been? She was 61 when she died. So, and the story makes it kind of questionable that she died of rabies, in that the distance between when she was supposedly bitten and when she died. I mean, there's a very good chance they just poisoned her, but because then they kill off her whole family. But if we assume that yes, she died of rabies, and if we look at where she was and the reason that they were so challenging her, if she had solidified her family more, or if she had been more successful in defeating the Zhou, then she would that would certainly impact Chinese culture. And it's hard to say. You're right. We might not have had the golden age that followed, or we might have had a different kind of golden age that was much more authoritarian. But she had still set a lot of the room for peace. But one of the things that we might have, especially if she maintains her power as queen and she has a significant impact on Confucianism, China is a very patriarchal society. Yeah. So what if China was a more matriarchal society? What what if simply, because this is 100 years before we finally had the Dowager Empress. I mean, what if China was a society that more leans upon women because she survived
Her
and
death.
because she beat this
Yeah.
Confucianism, which is, I mean, no matter what you want to say about Confucianism, it's a paternalistic culture. How different would China be today? How different would Chinese history be? That's an interesting question. It really is. It's hard to go that. I try to research that really too. If it's to go back and you kind of get an idea. If you're really trying to research, they'll kind of say, she would have been more authoritarian.
Yeah,
We really had a great time after that, a time of peace and prosperity. But really, it's kind of hard to guess exactly how it would change things. But I mean, certainly it could be significant if you have a whole different dynasty from one of the most powerful dynasties in Chinese history.
it might have descended into war, but it's hard to. There seems to be some idea that the people who she was very, very good at statecraft, that the people who followed her might not have been.
Mhm.
But we don't know a whole lot about them because they were all killed. But her fall was essentially used, I mean, as a literary tool for much of the rest of Chinese history. As one, she was uppity and came and took power that she shouldn't have, and she was punished by the gods for that, or by the people that she killed, and that it was supposed to be a warning to emperors too, to make sure that your wife or your dowager mother doesn't take too much power, and that was impactful, but it also shows you
Mhm.
how entrenched that patriarchal was already, because that's why they created those stories in the first place, right?
Yeah, I think she's quite interesting. It's hard to say. 61's really quite aged
Yeah.
for the time. So it's hard to say how much longer she would have kicked on anyway, or how much more she would accomplish. But certainly people were afraid of her, and yeah, so that indicates that she might have had a lot more potential.
Yeah, and a successful empress at that time would have set a precedent.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And as we've seen, especially in patriarchal societies, they tend to keep going patriarchal until something
Hmm.
really major happens to upset the assumptions, the beliefs, and the standards and norms. So might she have been that influence?
And the Chinese society is also very bureaucratic, and that's largely derived from Confucianism, and for the fact that for centuries they had that they had a Confucius test for the civil service, and who know? I mean, maybe the dynasties don't last as long if they don't have that, or maybe they last longer, or maybe they just are very different in character. But she was an important person in history
Yeah.
who purportedly died before her time. Hard to say how much before her time, but before her time because of rabies, and that it's a long ways back. But I mean, it might totally transform the whole nature of Chinese culture, which you would still bring forward into the modern world.
There was one other guy who I thought could be interesting. I think you also mentioned him, Charles Lennox, who was in charge of Canada. He was probably the most. I read a quote that called him the most powerful political and military figure on the continent at that time. And one of the things that his death leads to is that it leads to a power vacuum that gets rid of, essentially, I mean, weakens the British imperial control over the region for a while, and leads to another. I did an episode. I wrote it. You did it, of course, on the 1837 rebellions. And one of the reasons that happens is because of these oligarchical cliques that are battling
Hmm.
for control of Canada. And if Lennox had survived, I mean, he might have prevented essentially those rebellions. He might have meant lead to a unification of Upper and Lower Canada, which he seemed to have a vision for. I
Hmm.
mean, decades before it actually happened. And so, what would that mean on history? I mean, I guess that's hard to say. Those rebellions ultimately are put down, but there was unrest because that might have been avoided if he hadn't gotten into a scuffle with a pet fox that
Yeah,
ends up leading to
a
his
very a
death.
very bizarre way to die.
Yeah, and he's maybe, I mean, besides Empress Liu, one of the most important, highest ranking figures that was killed
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
by rabies.
And again, at a point where he certainly could have had more impact.
Yeah,
If it were not for, I mean, it's just a strange story. Who gets bitten by
yeah,
a fox? But Charles Lennox does. But and again, we might have eradicated foxes in America if rabies was still the problem that it once was.
yeah.
I mean, foxes are still one of the populations that are actually most at risk from rabies. That's a good question. That's a fair question. I mean, could he truly have transformed Canadian culture from the position that he was in?
Well, and, what would it mean if Canada did unite that? And several decades earlier, I don't know that it would have. I don't know that that would have altered World War One or World War Two. It might have had some meaning for Canadian history, and certainly there are pieces of Canadian history about those 1837 rebellions
Hmm.
that have hung on for all this time. That wouldn't exist today, but I don't know that when I was looking at that. Well, I think it's kind of interesting. I don't know that I could think of like a really good through line on the counterfactual scenario.
Actually, okay, 1837, and through the next 20 years, Canada unites under a very able statesman with military background. And that little dust up starts between the Union and the Confederate States of America in 1860. Does Canada, as an anti-slave entity, decide that well, actually, we have we do have a dog in this hunt. Let's send down some Canadian troops.
That's
That
interesting
it's a
because
That's an
possibility.
interesting
they
premise.
could
Yeah.
have made that decision outside of the imperial what Britain wanted, because for Canada that was right across the border. There was
Hmm.
not, well, to some extent there was actually some cross border stuff of Confederates going to Canada, and
Hmm.
it's not like it was totally out of their
Yeah,
wheelhouse.
they actually tended to sympathize more. I mean, they couldn't openly sympathize with the Confederacy because of
Yeah,
slavery, but they actually, I mean, at least allowed. It took a lot of
yeah,
pressure from the U.S. before they finally started kind of putting something down on the Confederate expats that were up there. It's an interesting
Yeah,
question, but
yeah,
a different Canada certainly could impact American history in significant ways.
yeah, and but to the Civil War, just I just want to make one final point: is Britain purchased so much American cotton. It was really the basis of a very large part of their economy,
Hmm.
and they needed that cheap they need cheap slave produced or slave grown, slave maintained cotton.
Hmm.
Um, Canada, however, was the destination point of the Underground Railroad.
Hmm.
So, Canada did not necessarily have the same economic interest with inexpensive cotton that England might have.
And that's an
So,
interesting question. If the Dominion of Canada had openly allied with the Federals in the
yeah.
Civil War, I mean that's a
mm,
that's a fairly big counterfactual. Uh,
mm.
uh,
Or they could have allied with the Confederates as well, in solidarity with their brethren across the pond in England, and perhaps there might have been more and more effective Confederate actions
Yeah.
that could have been, back to our previous one of our previous episodes about the burning of New York.
mhm.
Um, you know,
But yeah,
you know, yeah,
or the
yeah. What
attempted
if what
burning of
if
New York. Yeah.
what if Confederate sources had even a little better backing from Canada, or kind of a less of a just don't make waves and we won't bother you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Either
is
either
it is a
way.
little difficult to draw a line from Lennox's death to necessarily, either of those
Hmm.
scenarios. But I mean, Lennox could have impacted Canada governance in a number of ways, and then that could have impacted things. Again, yeah, that is someone. And we should be fair, and because we don't really know that it killed Poe, that there are some questions about whether that's actually what killed Lennox too. And that's
That's
one of
true.
the interesting things about the illness too.
Yeah.
So I mean, we don't know for sure it killed Emperor Lou. Yeah, we don't know for sure it killed Edgar Allan Poe. We don't know for sure it killed Lennox, but we know it's a very deadly illness, and so any of
Yep.
them certainly could be. Yeah,
Yep.
they're on the list of ones that are generally considered to have died of rabies.
Now, I do think that rabies might be one of the reasons why Bigfoot hasn't taken over the world. Because I'm just postulating, but perhaps he is particularly vulnerable, or he had his own kind of rabies Bigfoot zombie apocalypse that has kept them
It could be.
from.
I would think it's more likely, given where he lives in the wild, that he's probably rabies resistant.
That's possible
That would
too.
be my
That's
thought.
the.
And so,
What if they used it as a
obviously, if
weapon?
we hadn't gotten the rabies vaccine, would Sasquatchia have arisen because so many of us had died of rabies? But I think we can all agree Sasquatch is horrifying enough. A rabid Sasquatch is just
Yes.
a terrifying,
Now,
terrifying idea.
we should write that down so that no one steals that idea from us and makes a brilliant movie, or on the other
You're
hand,
right. You're right. Because it's
offers
going to
us
be
some kind of credit for when they do make that
when
movie.
they do for the rabid Sasquatch movie. Yeah, yeah.
We'll take 1%. Yeah, that's all we need.
That's all we need. Just for coming up with that brilliant idea. You heard it first here.
How do we? Well, we started with zombies, so why not? A rabid Nessie would be pretty terrifying too.
I can think of a lot of things that Rabid would like. My third grade teacher, Rabid. Oh no, no. That is the stuff of nightmares.
There's all sorts of things you don't want to be rabid. Aliens, UFOs. Yeah, what if UFOs came and then they were infected by rabies? Then maybe it's like War of the Worlds. Maybe rabies is what kept us from being overcome by UFOs, because anybody who watches the History Channel knows that they were ancient aliens, and maybe it was rabies that kept them away. Or on the other hand, what if we were being attacked by rabid aliens? I mean,
It's even worse.
So that's
Well,
even
you have to,
terrifying.
you just have to assume that an alien who has, something that's the equivalent of the phaser you can put on stun is going to look at a red fox and say, "That's really cute. I want to take one back to my ship." And suddenly,
up a fox. There we go. There's the movie premise. There, the alien captures a fox and turns the whole alien ship rabid, and then we've got alien, zombie, vampire, werewolf, Sasquatches attacking from outer space with ray guns. And
it can't be much sillier than like Iron Sky, where the Nazis get to the moon.
That's true, yeah.
As far as a premise.
I think we're right in Plan 9 from outer space territory there. That's right where we've landed, right there. Aren't they making zombies from the spaceship in Plan 9 from outer space? So, and if we're competing with what is generally considered to be the worst movie ever produced, I think we're seeing the quality of our ideas here.
I do think that even if we aspired to get a movie that was on Mystery Science Theater 3000, assuming that they're still still running that, then perhaps
they might revive
that
show just for the rabid aliens. Yes.
Look, personally, I think we've got $1 billion ideas here. We've come up with 4 or 5 great movies.
We have, I know. Our entire fortune is going to be lost because someone listens to our podcast and steals all of our great ideas.
Well, we will, in lieu of royalties, we will accept SpaceX stock, or NVIDIA, just say it.
That's
either one of those. That's fine.
Point.
That's fine.
Got it to offer us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow the History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.